I'm going to show you how to use the poker solver to max exploit the players in your game. I'll show you how to input a few assumptions on every street about what your opponents are doing and demonstrate how to use the solver to devise a strategy that ruthlessly exploits them for the most amount of money possible. Learning how to play GTO at equilibrium is fine. It gives you a wonderful baseline and a strategy to fall back upon, which, when executed perfectly, means you can never be exploited. But at its core, GTO at equilibrium is a defensive strategy, which means if your opponents cannot even spell equilibrium, hint, most of them can't, it means you're not going to be winning the most amount of money. So let me show you how to use a solver to win the most amount of money. Let's jump in. All right, so let's take a look at this hand here. We open up to $20 on the button. We're playing 2-5, 1K effective, and the villain is going to call in the big blind Jack 9 deuce with a couple of spades, and the villain is going to check it over to us. All right, so here is the solver. I prefer using Pile Solver just because it is completely customizable. There are no monthly subscription fees. It's a one-time cost, and everything you want to do, you can do just very, very easily. So this is my solver of choice, but if you prefer a different one, that will also work. So we are just going to input the board, which is Jack of spades, 9 of spades, deuce of clubs, the starting pot, which is $42, the effective stacks, which are $980, and now we're going to set up the bet sizes in position and out of position. So in position here, we're just going to give us a bet size of 20 chips. You can either set it as a percentage of the pot or the amount of chips. We're going to give out of position a raise size to 3.5x as well. Now on the turn, we're going to give us a small bet and a big over bet. And from out of position, if the flop goes check, check, we'll give them a half pot and a pot size bet. And then on the river, we're going to give us a bunch of different sizes here. 120 chips, 220 chips, 420 chips, and we're also going to add an all in for ourselves from in position. Now, let me show you the ranges we started with here. So this will be our range opening from the button. As you can see, we're opening a relatively wide range. This is just about 46% of hands. And this is an optimal 200 big blind solved opening range. So this is pretty much an equilibrium approved opening range from the button here. Let's look at our big blind defense range here. And I went a little bit wider than equilibrium. I think equilibrium's probably around 33 or 34%. Gave them about 38% here. I think people just call a little bit too wide in live poker. So I didn't go crazy, but I gave them a few more hands. And also I made them a little bit less aggressive closing the action here, because in equilibrium, pocket tens, pocket jacks, all these suited broadways just get 3-bet at a much higher frequency. And also the big blind's supposed to go relatively polar and start 3-betting some of these suited connectors, some of these suited gappers. I just don't think that happens much live. This looks like a reasonable big blind defense range. And if you can see, like, queens are 0.1, that just means that queens are getting 3-bet at 90% of the time, right? You see some of these hands over here, they just have maybe 10% of them. I think these hands are just mostly folded, but sometimes they're in there. For example, like a hand like 10-4 suited, I'd say maybe they call like 10% of the time. You can quibble with this, you can adjust it however you would like, but I think this is a decent starting point for a big blind defense range. If you want to solve, all you have to do, you're going to click build tree to set up the game tree that we've built, and then you're just going to click go, and you are going to solve it. I like to solve it to 0.5% of the pot. You can get a little bit more accurate if you want, but I think this is a reasonable starting point, gives us a nice little baseline. So again, you're just going to click build tree, and then you're going to click go, but I've already solved it because sometimes it takes 5 to 10 minutes to solve, and I want this video to go quickly. This has solved for equilibrium. We're going to go over to the browser. This is the out of position, the big blinds strategy on the flop. They're just checking 100% of the time. Now, here is our strategy from the button on the flop, and as you can see, we are betting about 50% of the time and checking back about 50% of the time. So now let's start getting into node locking, and I'm going to show you why, once we make a few assumptions, that just betting our entire range on the flop is probably more profitable than trying to play this mixed strategy. So here is the big blind's response when we bet $20 on the flop, and now we're just going to start adjusting or node locking the villain's response when we bet $20. This is the response in equilibrium. We're just going to change a few things that don't look accurate to how a live 2-5 player may play. All right, so we're going to go to set strategy and node lock here. As you can see, this is their entire range, and let's see how they play sets when we c-bet here on this flop. And I would say sets are just going to be fast played at a higher frequency, maybe not all the time, but I'd say at least 80% on this board when we c-bet. Let's go ahead and look look at 2 pair. Again, 2 pair, Jack 9 here. If they do have Jack deuce suited or 9 deuce suited, on a wet dynamic board, these hands are just going to be fast played at a high frequency. So we'll turn these up to 80% as well. Now let's go through and look at how they're playing some of their draws. So let's look at their flush draws, raising about 15% of the time. This seems fine. Let's go through and look at how they're playing some of their gut shots. And I would argue that gut shots here are not going to be raised at a 15% frequency, maybe 5% of the time. Also, I just don't think they're going to be folding a gut shot on the flop. So we're going to lock this to never fold and just raise 5% of the time. Now let's look at the 8-out straight draws. And again, I just don't think these are being raised 18% of the time. So maybe let's bump this to 7% or 7.5%, just slightly more than the 4-out straight draws, but less than the flush draws. Now let's go through and look at their combo draws. There's a expressions guide here, and you can just go through, find what you want to select, or you can just select the hands with your mouse manually over here. Combo draws are raising about 50% of the time. I'd say that is about fine. Maybe we'll go 40, 60 here. And now we're just gonna go through. Let's look at how their top pair is playing. So top pair is raising about 7% of the time. We'll bump that down to, that seems about right actually. Top pair raising about 7% of the time. Let's look at second pair. I don't think second pair is ever really raising here. This seems much more accurate to me. Before we had them raising about 7.5% of the time, and now we have them raising about 7% of the time. So not really a big adjustment here. So we are going to go ahead and click lock all here. We are going to save and close. Now we're going to go back to our post-flop tree builder, and we are just going to click go here. Do not click build tree. We've already built the tree. We don't want to rebuild it or it'll start us over. We just want to click go, and we are going to let this solve, and we will come back in just 1 minute. All right, so we are back. We have solved for when we node lock the response on the flop. Let's go back to our browser and now see when they check to us on the flop, we are now betting 98% of the time. So we can just simplify. This is essentially a range bet. All we did on the flop, we made them fast play their value slightly more, and we made them play their draws just slightly more passively. And look at that. All of a sudden, we can just get away with range betting here. Remember before, this was our response where we were betting about 50% of the time, checking about 50% of the time in equilibrium. And all we did was just a couple changes here. It's going to be the highest EV for us to range bet on the flop. So that's how I would start, just locking their response on the flop. All right, so we are going to range bet here on this flop. They are going to call, and now we are going to go to the blankest of blank most innocuous turns, a 4 of hearts here. And when villain checks over to us, what size should we bet on this turn? All right, so you see here when they check over to us on this turn, the solver does prefer going with this large size quite a bit. We're checking about 2/3 of the time and betting this large size about 1/3 of the time. But let's go through and let's start locking their response when we bet this large size and see if the solver is going to have some different ideas. So we are going to bet 150. This is their response in equilibrium, and we are going to go to set strategy and lock node here. And let's go through and let's start locking their response. All right, first of all, let's look at their sets here. Again, if they didn't raise the flop, they're probably going to be raising the turn at a high frequency. This looks fine. 2 pair as well, probably raising a little bit more than this. Now let's start looking at top pair. I think when we overbet the turn, top pair is probably not going to be raising here at any frequency. We'll set the folding to 0. And second pair, again, I don't think is raising at any frequency. Calling about 1/3, folding about 2/3. That seems okay. Let's look at their flush draws here. Flush draws, I think we can agree they are probably not raising here on this turn. I don't think people are just going to fold a flush draw when we overbet the turn. So let's turn this up. Let's have them calling more. And now let's look at their 4-out straight draws, which I imagine should mostly be folding. Maybe they call about 5% of the time. Let's look at their 8-out straight draws here. And I don't think people fold open-ended straight draws 93% of the time when we overbet the turn. So let's turn this up about 37% of the time here. And now let's look at our combo draws. So the combo draws here, folding 13%. I don't think that's accurate. I just don't think people fold a combo draw on the turn to an overbet. And now I would argue here that the type of person who is going to check call a combo draw on the flop, because remember, they just called on the flop. So if they get to the turn with a combo draw, they're probably not going to be the type of person who's now going to raise it on the turn. If someone's going to play their combo draw aggressively, they're probably going to play it aggressively on the flop. They're not going to wait to the turn to start check raising their combo draw. So I'm going to turn down this check raising frequency with the combo draws here, maybe about 10%. We are going to lock this. We are going to save and close. Now we are going to go back to our post-flop tree builder, and all we are going to do here is we are going to click go, and we are going to wait for this to solve. All right, so we are solved here. Let's go back to our browser and look at this on the turn where we were betting about 1/3 of the time before for the overbet size. Now we're betting more than half of the time. And as you see here, a lot of our range is just preferring to go really, really big on the turn. We're doing it with some bluffs, like gut shots, like 8-7 here. We're doing it with our value, like pocket aces. You can see the EV just strongly prefers going with this big, big size. I will say here, we've only locked the turn. If we really want the most accurate response here on the 4 of hearts turn, we would have to lock every single card on the river. If we just start lock them to maybe start overfolding a little on the river or even overcalling on the river, whatever mistakes they're going to make, our range is probably just going to prefer to go with this big, big size on the turn. So let's lock one river right now and let's figure out maybe the perfect size to bet on the river. All right, so we are going to bet 150 on the turn. They are going to call. The river is an offsuit 3. They check it over to us. What size would we bet on this river if we had a value hand, like say pocket 9s on this river? And what size might we want to bet if we have a bricked draw, say like 7-8 or 7-6 of diamonds? What size would we bet with those hands? So let's look at it from both perspectives here and let's dive in and let's node lock right now. All right, so we bet 150 on the turn. They call. We are going to a river, which is an offsuit 3. They check it over to us. And as you can see, we've got a couple of options here. We've got the 2x pot overbet jam for $810. We've got kind of the pot size, maybe a small overbet here for $450. And then we've got just a very, very small, maybe a 30% pot size bet on the river. So what size should we bet on this river? We're going to go in and lock the response when we bet 810, when we bet 450, and when we bet 120. So let's jump in right now. We're going to start off with 810. All right, so here we go. We select we bet 810, and now we are going to go to set strategy and node lock, and let's select the response when we jam this river for more than 2x pot. Let's look at top pair here. Top pair is calling about 40% of the time to a overbet on the turn and a 2x pot size bet on the river. Maybe they call a little bit less, maybe they call a little bit more. I don't know. We're going to leave that here. This is going to be very, very villain dependent, and you're just going to have to decide based upon the villain you're playing with. Now, second pair is calling 18% of the time. I would just argue that second pair is just folding all of the time here on this river. So let's make second pair fold. So we see top pair here is calling about 40% of the time, folding about 60% of the time. Let's say we're playing against the typical 2-5 live villain who just doesn't want to play for all of the money with top pair here. Let's say they're just going to fold just slightly more. Maybe they go 70-30 here, right? We see ace jack is still mostly calling here. King jack is still calling quite a bit, but now they're folding some of the queen jack and jack 10 and jack 8 and stuff like that. So we'll make them fold top pair. We'll make them fold second pair a little bit more here. We are going to lock this and we are going to save and close. Now let's go through and lock the response when we bet 450. What is top pair going to do? Well, it's certainly not going to raise. And I would say top pair is probably going to call a little bit more when we bet just over pot on this river. All the draws have bricked. The bet is not that scary. Let's say they call 75-25. Second pair maybe folds a little bit more than this. So let's say 80-20 with second pair. We're just going to have them call a little bit more with top pair. We're going to have them fold second pair a little more, and we're going to lock this and save and close. Now let's go through and lock the response when we bet 120. So we're just betting a very, very small 30% size pot size bet here on this river, and top pair, probably not raising, but probably just always calling here. Second pair, if they do get here with second pair, they shouldn't have much of it. Definitely not raising, but probably mostly calling here. And then let's go through and look at their ace highs. I would imagine that ace highs are almost always folding here if they get here with like an ace high flush draw. So let's say like 90-10, something like that. Let's look at their king highs here. Just don't think king highs are calling it 80% of the time. Let's say like they call 5% of the time they get sticky with a king high here on this river when we bet 30% pot. So we are going to lock it. We are going to save and close. We are going to go back to our post-flop tree builder, and we are just going to click go. We're going to wait for this to solve, and we will be right back. All right, so we are solved. Let's go back to our browser. And now you see here, we are betting each of these sizes for a reasonable amount, mostly just preferring to go with the big size and and the medium size, and we are checking almost never. Our good hands, like pocket nines or pocket deuces, are just very strongly preferring this middle size for 450, because that's where they're just almost always calling top pair. And then our bluffs here, let's say we have like an 8-7 of diamonds here, just very, very strongly prefers to jam all in. So every time we have a bluff, we have the 8-7 of diamonds, just going all in. We've got the 6-7 of diamonds, just going all in. When we go all in, we are just getting top pair to fold a good percentage of the time, and we are getting second pair to fold almost all of the time. All of our bluffs here are just wanting to jam all in. Almost all of our value, ace jack here, just want to go with this medium size, this small overbet to make sure we get called by top pair. Now, this is the cool part of node locking. You may be saying, hey, villains in my game just aren't folding top pair. Well, cool. All you have to do is go back into this big size here when we bet 8-10 and just select them to never fold top pair, and then you can spit out a response from the solver that will maximally exploit the players in your game. So if you think they're never folding top pair, well, when you go all in, just select that they never fold top pair. And then what's going to happen is your value size is probably going to be this big all-in size, and since they're calling way too much, our bluff size is probably just going to go in this small size here if they're just overcalling, just trying to get them to fold their ace highs, their king highs, when we have 8-7 of diamonds or 7-6 of diamonds. You can adjust their response based upon what you think the players in your game are doing and come up with a customized solution for yourself. Real quick, if you guys are enjoying this video, if you're enjoying how to use a solver to max exploit your opponents, click that subscribe button. Please, it pings the algorithm. It lets me know that you guys are enjoying this. I will make more videos like this. Thank you guys. Have a gentle day. All right, so I'm going to give you one more example here. We'll walk through it one more time on a slightly different run out. So let's say we c-bet on the flop here again. They check call, and now the turn is a flushing card. Well, what size should we be betting on this turn? All right, so we are going to select the 4 of spades here on the turn, and when they check it over to us, we have not locked this turn yet, so this is the equilibrium response. We're going to be doing some big betting, some small betting, and lots of checking. You may be wondering, why are we doing so much checking? Well, because we already are range betting on the flop, and the solver from the turn forward has our opponent playing perfectly. So we'll start off when we bet big here. We're going to go do set strategy and lock node. Flushes just raising 30% of the time when we overbet this turn. That seems reasonable when we 2x pot the turn. I don't think they're going to go crazy. Top pair, probably never raising. I would say top pair maybe folds slightly more than this, but maybe not. Let's just get rid of all of the raising from second pair here, and let's have second pair fold just a little bit more here. We are going to go ahead and lock this. We are going to save and close. So now let's go through and lock the response when we bet very, very small on this turn. So if we just bet about 40% pot on the turn, let's go through and lock the response. The first thing we're going to look at is how they play their flushes, and I think you can agree, I can agree, everybody can agree. When we bet very small on this turn, when they make a flush, they're just going to fast play a lot more from out of position. So let's have them fast play maybe 75-80% of their flushes are just going to get raised off here. Top pair is still going to get called to a small bet. Second pair, they're not turning this into a bluff, but I think maybe they start folding second pair a little bit more. Let's look at how maybe their 8-out straight draws are playing here now on this turn. When we bet small, I think those maybe call some percentage of the time here. Hands are turning into a bluff like the stiff ace of spades. I would argue that these hands are not playing anywhere near this aggressively. They're just mostly going to be calling. Of course, sometimes they turn these hands into a bluff, but not anywhere near this frequency. Also, these open-in straight draws with a spade or these gut shots with a spade, I would argue these hands do not play this aggressively either. We are going to turn down the raising frequency here with these hands as well. I would argue they just call a little bit more here, especially when they have the king of spades or the queen of spades here. So we'll have them still raise off sometimes. They're just going to call a little bit more. If sets didn't raise the flop, when the flush comes in on the turn, they're probably not going to be raising this much. So let's have the sets mostly call. Same with the 2 pair here. So now we are going to go ahead. We are going to lock this. We are going to save and close. We're going to go back to our post-flop tree builder. We are going to click go, and we are going to wait for this to solve. All right, so we are solved. Let's go back and look at that. We are betting the small size 55% of the time. Just like on the blank turns, we would need to lock every single river for the 4 of spades turn. So the deuce of hearts river, the deuce of clubs river, the jack of diamonds river, etc. river. We would have to lock every single river to get the most accurate response here on the turn. We don't have time to do that today. However, just a little plug, that is something we have done for our defaults for Hungry Horse Poker. So if you are interested in getting all of these defaults built out based upon node locking for every single type of player in your game, consider joining one of our 28-day boot camps. All right, plug aside, here is the turn response. Notice we're just using the small size a ton, and we look at the EV here. Most of our range just prefers going very, very small on this turn because they are just going to be raising off their flushes. They're just going to be calling with their top pair, their second pair, their open-enders plus a spade, and they're just going to get to the river with a wide, weak range. So our value prefers going small here. Say we have a hand like ace queen of spades or ace eight of spades. These hands prefer going small because when they also have a flush, they are going to put in more money for us. They're going to check raise and make the pot bigger for us. And also these hands prefer going small because if they have a weak hand, if they have pocket eights with a spade, if they have a hand like queen 10 with the 10 of spades, when we bet small, they are just going to continue at a much higher frequency. So the cool part about going small with our value here is they put in more money for us when they are beat, and they just continue to call when they have hands that are drawing dead. The really cool part about this when we are bluffing, say we have a hand like 7-6 of diamonds here, we just allow them to get to the river with a wide and weak range because they start raising off their strong hands right now when we bet so small on the turn. All right, so what size should we bet on the river with both our value and our bluff? So we bet $30 on the turn, they call, now the river is a blank and they check it over to us. What size should we bet here? Let's go through and lock this river and find out. All right, so we bet 30, they call, we get the 3 of hearts on the river and they check it over. We've got a couple different options here for sizes. We've got the 220, which is an overbet here on this river, and we've got 120, which is about 80% pot. So let's go through and lock the responses when we choose both of those sizes. When we bet 220, which is the overbet, let's go through and lock the response. So what is top pair doing when we overbet this river? I would argue that top pair is probably almost always folding here. The flush draw came in on the turn. We triple barreled. I would say top pair folds a significant amount here, maybe 75% of the time. When they do have two pair, they're just going to be calling. When they have a set, they're just going to be calling. When they have a flush here, when we overbet on this river, they're probably going to be mostly calling, sometimes raising. Let's say they raise off like their nut flushes here. Let's say they get here with second pair. I would say this hand is just almost pure folding here when we overbet this river. Let's lock their response when we overbet on the river, and we will save and close. And now let's go through and do the same thing when we bet, say, 3/4 pot here. Now, let's say they have top pair. They're just going to be calling quite a bit more. Let's say this looks reasonable. With second pair, mostly folding. That seems fine. They have flushes. And again, I would say flushes sometimes call, sometimes raising here when we choose a little bit of a smaller size. Two pairs just going to be always calling. Sets, I imagine, just always calling. When they have these hands with a stiff nut flush blocker here, I would imagine these hands just aren't really calling here at any frequency. Maybe sometimes they're raising 5% of the time, but just not at this frequency. And let's say they fold 95% of the time here. So we are going to go through and lock this. All right, so you see here, remember in equilibrium, we're going about 20%, 23% with each. Now let's go through, let's solve for this river. All right, and we are solved. So let's go back to our browser. And now look at this, look at our strategy. We are almost barely checking here. We're using the big size a ton, using the small size about 1/4 of the amount. And let's go through and look at what hands want to do what. Let's say we have a set like nines here. Well, nines, you can see the EV very clearly just wants to use this kind of like 3/4 pot sizing, much higher EV. Let's say we have a flush here, ace 8 of spades. Again, when we have the nuts here, wants to use this kind of 3/4 pot size bet here on the river. And let's say we do get here with a bluff like 7-6 of diamonds. Well, 7-6 of diamonds just wants to go for the big overbet size. The reason why when we go for this overbet size, they just get to the river with so much ace jack, king jack, jack 10 because we went small on the turn, and this overbet size gets them to fold all of those hands. And when we choose this 3/4 pot size, well, now they're just going to be calling quite a lot with their top pair. Remember, since they're raising so many flushes on the turn, they just don't get to the river with very many strong hands. So it makes sense why our bluffs want to go very big on this river and why our value wants to choose a reasonable size. If you're playing against a player who maybe slow plays a little bit more, you could put some more flushes in their range. And that's the cool part about doing this node locking. You can adjust their response based upon what you believe the villains in your game are actually doing. So it's not really about the calibration that I used here. It's more about showing you how to use this tool to come to your own conclusions. So on this river, what we would want to do when we have a value hand like ace-8 of spades or pocket nines, we want to bet around 120, give them a reasonable price. And when we get to this river with complete air, like 8-7 of diamonds or 7-6 of diamonds, we just want to go for the big bet, go 220, overbet on this river, get them to fold all their top pair and lose the minimum when they do have a trapped flush. All right, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video on how to use a solver to max exploit your opponents and win the most amount of money. Hopefully this skyrockets your opponent and makes you one of the biggest boys around. Thank you guys and have a gentle day.